The sound wakes you in the dead of the Icelandic winter. It is not the howling wind. It is the sound of heavy, frozen footsteps walking directly across the turf roof of your longhouse. The timber groans under a weight that is impossible for a living man. The hearth fire suddenly flickers and burns a sickly, pale blue. Your livestock in the attached barn begin to scream, a sound of absolute, mind-shattering panic. You do not grab your sword. A sword cannot kill what is already dead. You pull the furs over your head and pray to Odin that the roof holds. Because the thing walking above you is not a ghost, and it is not a mindless zombie. It is a neighbor. It is a chieftain. It is a Draugr. In the freezing, isolated farmsteads of the Viking Age, the greatest fear was not an invading army, a harsh famine, or the wrath of a mythical god. It was the dead refusing to stay in the earth. To understand the terrifying reality of the Norse undead, you must first completely erase your modern understanding of what a walking corpse is. Modern pop culture has conditioned us to view the undead in two very distinct ways. They are either ethereal, transparent spirits that pass through walls and cannot affect the physical world, or they are mindless, rotting bodies driven only by a viral hunger for flesh, devoid of any personality or intelligence. The Draugr is neither of these things, which makes it infinitely more terrifying. It is the absolute worst combination of physical invulnerability, supernatural power, and human malice. For the Norse and the early Icelanders, the boundary between life and death was not a spiritual departure. It was a physical transition. When a man died, his soul did not immediately fly off to Valhalla or Helheim. A fundamental part of his essence remained inextricably bound to his physical corpse. The body was still the person, just in a different state of being. And if that person was a tyrant, a miser, or a violently bitter man in life, that malice did not dissipate upon death. Concentrated. It fermented in the cold earth of the burial mound. The Norse called them hogby, the mound-dwellers, or apterganger, the again-walkers. They did not rise because of a demonic curse, an ancient spell, or a biological virus. They rose because their own sheer willpower and stubborn greed refused to let go of the physical world. Consider the saga of Thorolf Twistfoot, one of the most infamous Draugr in Icelandic literature from the Erbygja saga. In life, Thorolf was a brutal, aging Viking chieftain. He was mean-spirited, abusive to his family, and driven by an insatiable greed for land and power. When he finally died of old age, sitting upright in his high seat, his face was locked in a terrifying grimace of pure rage. His son, Arnkell, knew immediately what was coming. Arnkell did not approach his dead father from the front, fearing the evil eye of the corpse. He approached from behind, threw a cloth over Thorolf's head, and performed the grim rituals necessary to bind the dead, including tying the toes together so the corpse could not walk. But even with these precautions, the burial was a nightmare. The oxen pulling Thorolf's sled up the mountain suddenly dropped dead from sheer exhaustion. The corpse was growing heavier. This is a terrifying and unique hallmark of the Draugr. They do not decay into fragile skeletons or rotting meat. Their bodies undergo a grotesque, supernatural hypertrophy. They become swollen, their flesh turning either hellblar, the dark, bruised blue of frozen meat, or NR4, the pale, bloodless white of a corpse. Their physical mass increases exponentially until they weigh as much as solid rock, making it impossible to move them further. Arnkell was forced to bury his father right there on the ridge, far short of the intended grave, sealing him beneath a massive pile of heavy stones. Almost immediately, the valley descended into terror. Thorolf did not stay in his mound. He rose from the earth, completely retaining his human intelligence and his malicious personality, but now enhanced with the dark, chaotic powers of the grave. He didn't shamble aimlessly through the snow. He actively targeted the people and the livestock he hated in life. Cattle were found with their backs snapped in half. Shepherds were found completely crushed, their bones pulverized into powder by the sheer, overwhelming physical mass of the undead chieftain. The valley became a wasteland. Farms were abandoned, and families fled their ancestral homes. The psychological horror of the Draugr is that it is a localized, intimate terror. You are not being hunted by an unknown monster from the deep ocean. You are being hunted by your grandfather, your neighbor, your former chieftain, who now possesses the strength of a troll and a heart full of freezing hatred. The physical strength of the Draugr is beyond human comprehension, but their abilities extend far beyond mere muscle. They are shapeshifters. A Draugr can manipulate its physical form, slipping through cracks in the rock or sinking directly into the solid earth as if it were water, swimming through the soil and reappearing miles away. They can increase their size at will, swelling to monstrous proportions to physically block doorways or crush their victims under their immense weight. They control the weather, bringing sudden, blinding blizzards and freezing fog to disorient their prey and plunge the landscape into darkness. But perhaps their most terrifying ability involves the mind. The Draugr can enter the dreams of the living, driving them to madness or leaving behind physical curses that manifest when the victim wakes. In the sagas, those who lock eyes with a Draugr often fall violently ill, their minds broken by the sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from the corpse. They are also known to ride the roofs of houses. The husumudder or house riding was a terrifying phenomenon where the Draugr would straddle the peak of a longhouse roof, pounding its frozen heels against the timber until the inhabitants inside went mad from the noise, or the roof simply collapsed under the creature's impossible weight, burying the family alive. To truly grasp the escalating, unavoidable horror of an Apturgangr haunting, we must look at the legendary Grettis saga and the terrifying tale of Glam the shepherd. Glam was a massive, surly Swede hired by a wealthy farmer named Thorhall to tend sheep in a notoriously haunted valley in Iceland called Forsaludal. Glam was arrogant, irreligious, and possessed a booming, abrasive voice. He scoffed at the local superstitions and openly mocked the ghosts of the valley. On Christmas Eve, a time when the Norse believed the barrier between the living and the dead was at its absolute thinnest, Glam demanded his meat, ignored the holy fast, and went out into the blinding blizzard to tend the flock. He never returned. The next day, the search party found a scene of apocalyptic violence high in the mountains. The snow was trampled and soaked in dark blood, the heavy rocks shattered as if a titan had fought there. They found Glam's body. He had been killed by something inhuman, his flesh torn and his bones broken, but the horror was only beginning. When the men tried to bring his body down to the church for a holy burial, the corpse became impossibly heavy. Even a team of strong horses could not drag him down the mountain. They were forced to leave him there. A second attempt was made days later, but Glam had grown so heavy that the men could not even lift his shoulders. They were forced to bury him right there under a pile of stones in the freezing, shadowy pass. That very night, the haunting began. Glam did not rest. Whatever ancient evil had killed him in the mountains had infected him, merging with his already abrasive, violent personality to create a Draugr of unparalleled malice. People heard his booming, unnatural voice echoing through the dark valleys, louder and more distorted than in life. He began to ride the roof of Thorhall's farm, his massive weight causing the massive oak timbers to scream and fracture in the dead of night. The farmhands were paralyzed with terror. Men who dared to go out at night were found the next morning beaten to death, their bodies mangled and thrown carelessly across the frozen fields. The livestock were slaughtered by the dozens, their necks snapped with brutal efficiency. The haunting escalated to the point where no one would work at the farm. Thorhall was driven to the brink of ruin, his wealth vanishing into the snow. In desperation, he hired a new shepherd, a massive, brave man who claimed he feared no ghost. But within months, he too was found leaning against a stone wall, dead, with his neck completely broken by Glam's impossible strength. The Draugr of Glam had successfully claimed the valley. He walked in the daylight now, a towering, blue-black corpse, his eyes burning with a freezing, hateful light that paralyzed anyone who looked into them. He was an unstoppable force of nature. Iron weapons glanced off his swollen, frozen flesh. The psychological toll of living in a valley ruled by a Draugr cannot be overstated. It was a state of perpetual, freezing siege. You could not sleep for the pounding on the roof, you could not work the fields for fear of being crushed, and you could not escape because the snows were too deep. The dead man owned the land now, and he demanded absolute, violent submission from the living. The valley of Forsaludal was descending into a graveyard, waiting for a hero strong enough to do the impossible: kill a monster that had already died. The story of Glam reaches the ears of Grettir Asmundarson, the most famous outlaw and warrior in Icelandic history. Grettir was not a normal man. He possessed the strength of a troll and a temperament to match. He sought out the haunted valley of Forsaludal, not out of altruism, but out of a desperate need to test his own legendary strength against the supernatural. He arrived at Thorhall's ruined farm in the dead of winter. The few remaining servants were terrified, warning Grettir that the Apturgangur would tear him apart just as it had the others. But Grettir simply wrapped himself in his thick cloak and lay down on a bench in the great hall, waiting for the night to fall. He did not light a fire. He did not draw his sword. He knew that steel was practically useless against the swollen, frozen flesh of a mound dweller. This would have to be a battle of raw, violent leverage. As the midnight hour approached, the temperature in the hall plummeted. The frost crept up the wooden walls. Then came the sound. It started as a heavy, rhythmic thudding on the frozen turf of the roof. The Husumudder had begun. The massive oak rafters groaned and splintered under an impossible, crushing weight. The Draugr was riding the house, trying to collapse it upon the living. But when the roof held, the thudding stopped. A suffocating silence fell over the farm. Then, the heavy wooden doors of the great hall blew inward with a deafening crash. Glam stood in the doorway. He was no longer human. The Draugr had swollen to the size of a giant, his head brushing the high lintel of the doorframe. His flesh was the color of a bruised corpse, Helblar, and his massive hands dragged along the floor. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in Grettir's veins. They were wide, unblinking, and burned with a pale, malicious fire that illuminated the darkness of the hall. Glam stepped inside, the floorboards shattering under his immense weight. He saw the shape of Grettir wrapped in the cloak and lunged. Grettir did not run. He met the Draugr head-on. The two titans collided in the center of the hall. This was not a fight of skill or technique. It was an apocalyptic struggle of absolute, terrifying mass. They grappled, smashing through the wooden benches and splintering the support pillars. The Draugr's grip was like a vice of solid ice, trying to crush Grettir's ribs, but the hero planted his feet and pushed back with a strength that defied human limits. They tore the interior of the longhouse to pieces in the dark. Glam, realizing he could not easily crush this opponent, tried to drag Grettir outside into the freezing night. He knew his power was absolute under the open sky. Grettir fought desperately to stay inside, bracing his feet against the massive stone threshold of the door. The wood screamed, the stones cracked, and with a final explosive surge of power, the entire doorframe shattered. Both men tumbled backward, crashing out into the deep snow. The clouds parted, and the bright, cold light of the full moon illuminated the snowscape. Glam fell on his back, and for a split second, the moonlight struck the Draugr's eyes directly. Grettir, exhausted and bruised, looked down and made the most fatal mistake of his life. He looked directly into the dead, burning eyes of the monster. In that moment, the Draugr's physical struggle ceased, and the true, supernatural horror of the undead was unleashed. Glam spoke. His voice was a booming, hollow sound that seemed to echo from the bottom of a grave. He delivered a curse that would doom the greatest hero of Iceland. Glam told Grettir that he had earned his strength, but from this day forward, he would never grow stronger. He decreed that every deed Grettir performed would turn to bad luck, that he would be outlawed and hunted by his own people. But the final, most terrifying part of the curse was psychological. Glam condemned Grettir to forever fear the darkness. He swore that his dead, burning eyes would forever haunt Grettir's vision, making every shadow a nightmare, until the madness drove him to his death. As the curse hung in the freezing air, Grettir's legendary courage broke. A profound, unnatural terror seized him, a fear of the dark that he would never conquer. But his survival instinct overpowered his terror. Before the Draugr could rise, Grettir drew his short sword, his sax, and with a desperate, brutal swing, He severed the monster's massive head. The valley of Forsaludal was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. The Draugr was dead, but the victory was entirely hollow. Grettir had survived, but his life was functionally over, destroyed by a psychological curse delivered by a rotting corpse. But severing the head of a Draugr is not enough to stop it. The Norse knew that the malice in the flesh was too deep, too concentrated to simply be killed by a blade. To permanently destroy a mound dweller, a very specific and gruesome ritual had to be followed. Grettir took the severed head of Glam and placed it firmly between the creature's own thighs. This humiliating act was believed to confuse the corpse, preventing the head from finding its way back to the neck and preventing the creature from walking again. But even this was only a temporary measure. The physical body had to be utterly annihilated. The frozen, swollen flesh was dragged to a massive pyre and burned until absolutely nothing remained but cold, white ash. But you could not simply leave the ashes on the ground. The earth itself could be poisoned by the residue of the Draugr. The ashes were collected in a leather sack and either cast into the deepest, fastest-flowing part of the ocean, or carried to a desolate, barren wasteland far from any human settlement and buried deep underground. Only then, when the physical vessel of the malice was completely erased from the world, could the haunting truly end. This extreme protocol reveals the profound, visceral terror the Vikings held for the Draugr. They did not fear the soul escaping to the afterlife. They feared the body refusing to let go of the earth. But why did this specific, terrifying myth evolve? What was the psychological or environmental reality that required the invention of the Draugr? The answer lies in the unforgiving nature of the Scandinavian and Icelandic environment, and the complex social structures of the Viking Age. The most immediate connection is the brutal reality of the winter. In a world without central heating, antibiotics, or reliable food networks, the winter was a mass murderer. People died frequently, and when they did, the ground was often too frozen solid to dig a proper grave. Corpses had to be stored in outbuildings or shallow cairns until the spring thaw. Living for months with the frozen bodies of your deceased neighbors and family members mere yards from your door creates a profound psychological strain. The Draugr, with its frozen, Hellblar flesh and its association with blizzards and the dark months, is the literal personification of the deadly, inescapable winter. Furthermore, there is the reality of contagious disease. If a person died of a highly infectious illness and days later their family members began to fall sick and die as well, the Norse did not understand germ theory. They saw a terrifying, supernatural pattern. The dead person was reaching out from the grave, dragging their loved ones down into the dark with them. The Draugr's ability to curse the living, to bring sickness and madness, was a supernatural explanation for the very real, very devastating spread of plague and infection within isolated, tightly knit communities. But there is a deeper, more sociological layer to the myth. The Draugr is almost always a wealthy, greedy, or tyrannical person in life. They are the chieftains who hoarded their silver, the farmers who refused to share their harvest, the violent men who ruled by fear. In the Norse world, wealth and land were meant to be passed down, ensuring the survival of the next generation. A Draugr is the ultimate perversion of this social contract. It is an ancestor who refuses to pass the torch. By remaining in their burial mound, fiercely guarding their grave goods and terrorizing anyone who comes near their land, the Draugr represents the suffocating weight of the past refusing to make way for the future. The horror of the Draugr is the horror of inheritance denied. It is the fear that the sins and the greed of your fathers will not die with them, but will rise up to crush you. The Viking Age was a time of exploration, conquest, and profound bravery, but it was also a time of deep, existential anxiety. The world was dark, the winters were endless, and the boundary between the living and the dead was terrifyingly thin. The Draugr reminds us that sometimes the monsters we face are not foreign invaders or mythical beasts. Sometimes the most unstoppable terror is the legacy of human cruelty, frozen in the ice, refusing to stay buried. Thank you for walking through the freezing dark with Mythos Atlas. We have faced the unstoppable undead of the Vikings, a terror of pure, physical malice. But our map continues to unfold. If you survived the house riding of the Draugr, leave a comment below and let us know which nightmare we should map next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to join our ongoing expedition into the darkest corners of human mythology. Next time, we are leaving the freezing fjords and traveling to the deep, suffocating swamps of the American South. We are tracking a creature that stalks the bayous, a beast that is half man, half wolf, and entirely bloodthirsty. Prepare yourselves for the cursed legend of the Rougarou. Until then, keep your hearth fires burning bright, never look a corpse in the eyes, and remember, just because they are buried doesn't mean they are gone. This has been WA Mythos Atlas. Stay safe in the dark.